Some of the biggest stories in the world don't start in fancy places. They start small, in a cramped apartment, in a family that didn't have much money, with a kid who had nothing but his imagination to keep him busy. That's exactly where this story begins. George R.R. Martin was born in a working-class neighborhood in New Jersey. His father spent his days working on the docks, loading and unloading ships. It was hard, physical work, and it didn't pay much. Money was always tight in the Martin household. There weren't a lot of vacations, fancy dinners, or store-bought toys. But young George found a way to make his own fun, and it turned out to be something that would shape the rest of his life. He loved telling stories. Even as a small boy, he'd sit down and write little tales, usually spooky ones about monsters, and then sell them to the other kids in his building for just a few cents. It wasn't about the money. It was about seeing people react to his stories, seeing their eyes light up or their faces go pale. That feeling stuck with him. Comic books were another big part of his childhood. He couldn't get enough of them, especially the superhero stories that were popular at the time. He'd read them over and over, losing himself in worlds full of heroes, villains, and adventure. Looking back, it's easy to see how those early comic books planted a seed. Years later, he'd end up creating his own massive world, just on a much bigger scale. Here's a story that a lot of people find surprising. As a kid, George kept turtles as pets. Sadly, a bunch of them didn't survive very long. Instead of just feeling sad and moving on, young George turned the whole thing into a story in his head. He imagined his turtles belonged to different rival kingdoms, all fighting each other, plotting and betraying one another. It sounds like a small, silly thing, but if you think about it, it's almost a tiny preview of the kind of stories he'd write when he grew up. Stories full of powerful families fighting for control, full of unexpected betrayals, and full of characters who don't always make it to the end. As George got older, he went off to college to study journalism. This was during a tense period in American history. The Vietnam War was going on, and many young men were being sent overseas. George didn't want to fight in the war, so he applied for a special status that let him do other kinds of service instead of joining the military. While he waited and worked through that chapter of his life, he stayed busy. He organized game tournaments for fun and kept writing whenever he had free time. Science fiction was his favorite thing to write, and he kept sending his stories out to magazines, hoping someone would publish them. Eventually, someone did. His first story sale happened when he was still a young man, and it didn't take long for people in the science fiction world to start noticing his name. One of his early stories was so well received that it won him a top award in the genre. That kind of recognition doesn't happen to everyone, and it gave George the confidence to keep going. By the late 1970s, he published his very first novel. It wasn't a bestseller that made him rich overnight, but it was proof that he could write a full-length book, not just short stories. Around this same time, he was teaching at a college, helping other people learn about journalism and writing. But everything changed when a close friend of his, another writer, passed away unexpectedly. That loss hit George hard, and it made him think about his own life and what he really wanted to do with it. He decided that teaching wasn't his path, writing was. So he made the leap and became a full-time writer. He also made a big move around this time, relocating to Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's a place he still calls home today, decades later. Something about the quiet, artistic energy of the city seemed to suit him. Over the next several years, George wrote a string of books that covered all kinds of genres: science fiction, horror, and fantasy. He wasn't boxing himself into just one style. Some of these books earned him more awards, and by this point, people in the writing world respected him as a serious, talented author. But even with all that respect, his books weren't exactly flying off the shelves. Commercial success was still out of reach. So George tried something different. He shifted over to writing for television. He worked on a few well-known shows, learning the ropes of screenwriting and how stories worked in a totally different format. At first, this seemed like an exciting new chapter. But it came with a big downside. Television has limits. Budgets are tight. Executives have the final say. If George wanted a scene with a massive battle or a huge sprawling castle, the answer was often, "We can't afford that," or "That's too complicated to film." For someone with as much imagination as George, this was frustrating. He had entire worlds in his head, and television just couldn't hold them. That frustration ended up being a turning point. George realized that if he wanted to build something huge, something with no budget limits, no network executives saying no, he needed to go back to writing novels. Books don't need a special effects budget. A writer can create an entire kingdom, a war, a dragon, anything, using nothing but words. So, in the early 1990s, George sat down and started working on something new. This wasn't going to be a small story. He wanted to build an enormous fantasy world, filled with different noble families, each fighting for power and control over a kingdom. He wanted political scheming, unexpected deaths, and characters who felt real and flawed, not perfect heroes who always win. The first book in this new series came out in 1996. Right away, readers noticed something different about it. This wasn't the typical fantasy story where the good guys are always safe. Characters that readers loved could die without warning. Political plots were twisted and complicated, just like real history. People couldn't stop talking about it. Encouraged by the response, George kept building the story. He wrote more books in the series, each one expanding the world even further, introducing new characters, new kingdoms, and new conflicts. Fans devoured each new release, eagerly waiting to see which family would rise to power next, and which character might not survive the next chapter. By this point, George had done something pretty rare. He had built an entire universe from scratch, its own history, its own languages, its own map, its own wars stretching back centuries. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a whole world that readers wanted to live in, even with all its danger and chaos. Looking back at where this all started, it's kind of amazing. A boy from a working-class family, selling monster stories for pocket change, ended up creating one of the richest, most detailed fictional worlds ever put on paper. He didn't have connections, a fortune, or an easy path. What he had was patience, persistence, and a wild imagination that never really stopped running. And that's really the heart of this story. Big things don't always start big. Sometimes they start with a kid, a notebook, and a handful of pets who accidentally inspired an entire kingdom's worth of drama. George R.R. Martin took a simple love for storytelling and turned it into something that would eventually be read, watched, and loved by millions of people all over the world.